It all started when this man, David Dangoor, asked me to do a couple of days' work.
Now to Seymour, please.
Another job, another Monday.
There we are, we're late again.
I went to film an anniversary video for some North Londoners playing volleyball. "Who's in your team?" I said. "We're all Iraqi Jews." Jews from Iraq. Babylonian Jews, the very first Jewish exiles. The ones in the Psalms. In Iraq since biblical times. They told me Baghdad was almost half Jewish. 150,000. Now there are 6. That means I'm looking at more of them here on this court than there are in the city they all came from. Baghdad.
You got to accentuate the positive feeling, minate the negative.
Baghdad was gorgeous, they said. They didn't want to leave.
Don't mess with Mr. In Between. You gotta spread joy up to the maximum, bring gloom down to the minimum.
They stayed too long. Don't you know when you need to get out? No, you don't, they said. You get it wrong. Our parents got it wrong. I realised I didn't know much about Judaism, although I'm half Jewish, and almost nothing about Iraq before Saddam, although it was British. But I could see that they'd been burnt by what happened there. But what happened there? What poisoned their lives in Iraq? A few days later, I went up to David's house. It was a big executive sort of house in the expensive suburbs of North London.
Let me show you the albums.
Oh, wow.
All time in Baghdad.
This was the life. I hadn't imagined party balloons.
Life was good for them in Baghdad. They had a lot of parties. That's my mum. And she was crowned Miss Baghdad 1947.
Crowned Miss Baghdad?
Yes, that's right.
God. She's very beautiful. What I was thinking was, it must be some kind of fix. A Jewish Miss Baghdad in Iraq. But there she was. Gorgeous. With her statuette and her sash. And then he told me the story.
On New Year's Eve, 1946, my father said to my mum, there was a very fancy party at the Amana Hall where the royal family and ministers of government were going to be. And some of the officers in the army that did the same training course that I did. When they walked in, there was a competition going on, something that hadn't happened before in Baghdad, Miss Baghdad, and they were down to the last 5 girls, finalists. And when my mum walked in, the regent and the minister said, we can't let this competition carry on unless this young lady agrees to join the final 5. She said, I hadn't come here for this, but she was persuaded. And sure enough, she was chosen as the winner. And appeared in the newspaper the next day.
Do you think it was strategic?
They were taken with her and they thought she was a worthy person to wear that name and sash. And so I think it was totally done on what they thought was her merit.
Really?
And really Baghdad was like that. I mean, at that time, sectarianism was still something they were trying to reduce and look forward to a modern cosmopolitan country. Perhaps the fact that she was elected proved it.
It certainly proved something. And David himself went on to have an untroubled Iraqi childhood at Jewish school in Baghdad.
Here we are. So, these are from my time in primary school in Baghdad. I was at Franchini School, Madrasat Franchini. These are my report cards in Arabic. That's my name, David Naim Dangour. Of course, you always had the name of your father as your second name. So David Naim, my father, Dangour, my surname. And this was history as we learnt it.
Children learnt that their country was once Babylon. It had hanging gardens and was where writing and mathematics were born. Jewish children learnt how it was once the intellectual centre of the Jewish world, how they were enslaved by Nebuchadnezzar, and how, by the waters of Babylon, they sat down and wept. However, by the time David's father came along, things were going significantly better for the Jews. David's grandfather was running a successful printing business. The Dangours moved out of Baghdad's rickety Jewish quarter to live in a fabulous new house on Abu Nawas Street, looking over the Tigris at the royal palace. By now I was hooked. How did this golden moment come about? And how did it come to be destroyed? David suggested I go to see his father's sisters, Doreen and Eileen, who spent their youth by the river with him.
Oh, hi, Fiona. How are you?
Now the sisters have flats, one above the other, in the centre of London. Doreen appeared to have a huge roll of fabric. Careful, careful.
This is my grandfather, the chief rabbi of Iraq.
Yeah, it was hanging in our sitting room in Baghdad to show that life was
good. The king, of course, in the middle.
King Faisal I.
His speech was that Iraq now, we don't have religions. We are all Iraqis, Jews, Muslim, and Christian. We are all Iraqis.
The time of King Faisal, for the Jews, it was a good time.
It was paradise. Really, it was very, very nice.
The contrast between before the British and after the British was dramatic. Before 1917, Rabbi Ezra Dangour was a powerful guy, but in a tiny world. The Jews lived under strict Turkish rules. Baghdad was a sleepy outpost of the Ottoman Empire. With the British in charge, the Dangours cast off their robes and their beards, started wearing sharp new suits, and went into business. Winston Churchill chose a king, Faisal, a pliable Saudi sheikh who was supposed to establish British values, but 3 countries and scores of different tribes had been rammed together. They never got along. David's 8th cousin, imagine knowing that, was the son of a Baghdadi MP in the 1950s. He's also David Shamash. He played in the volleyball team for 15 years and lives half a mile from David Dangour in London.
My father was asked to represent the Jewish minority, and he became an MP. In appearance, they wanted to have representations from the minorities. I'm sure the Christians also had MPs. They were trying to follow the British system as much, although I think it was a one-party government. This is my father. He was probably translating. It was taken in Vienna. This is my mother. This is the Prime Minister of Iraq at the time, and this was the Minister of Interior. And he got very excited that night. He took out a gun and he started shooting it in the air. He was just a typical Iraqi male.
The Iraqi government was steeped in blood. From the beginning they had suppressed the political aspirations of the provinces, often brutally. But the Jews were never part of that. Landless urbanites, they weren't a threat. They were in government.
My father had a very close connection with the Muslim people that were in power. And we had a lot of Muslim ministers coming to our house to have dinner and play cards. It was an open house. I remember that we used to get up in the morning, the coffees were being served, and they were still playing cards.
But you knew your place. It's not a simple strand. These are Jews and these are allied with the monarchy that is allied with Britain, the colonialists. So there was obviously resentment and jealousy. My father was once told, Naim, you're such a wonderful person. It's such a shame you're a Jew.
In 1939, the monarchy and the Jewish community that depended on it began to look vulnerable when the country's third king, also called Faisal, was crowned, aged 3. And also in 1939, the Dangors acquired a new neighbour. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was one of the many Palestinians who came to Iraq thinking it was a suitable place from which to rid the Middle East of the British and the Jews. He could see the Dangors from his windows when they played in the garden. His plan was to start with a coup. The most obvious allies were the Germans. One day in April 1941, the political tension had risen so high, the young king and his family fled. A little later, the Mufti was at the centre of a new pro-German, pro-Nazi government in Baghdad.
Our cameraman in Iraq now sends us these pictures during the final attack.
But Winston Churchill got troops there first.
And here go the armoured cars in a dash across the desert. RAF planes batter the rebel troops into submission, making them realise that Hitler is not monarch of oil he surveys.
By the end of May 1941, not for the last time, the British were advancing on Baghdad. The government fled, and in the leaderless city, the Mufti sent his men out onto the streets. They sparked a riot against the Jews, who were seen as supporting the British. And after the first death, the violence spread rapidly. Eileen was 11. She was at home in Abu Nawas Street, waiting anxiously. Freddie, her son, who also grew up there, has come to visit while she makes macaroons.
They all like it. My brother, he was coming home, and he saw 2 people slaughtered on the pavement. So he came and said, "Don't go out. It's very dangerous."
People went to the Jewish quarters, to the shops, started looting.
We were stuck in the house, my father and my brothers. They had their revolvers, their gun, and we could see people looting.
The British army was stationed outside Baghdad, and for 2 days they didn't enter. So there was lawlessness in these 2 days.
They could have helped. They could have entered the Baghdad sooner, but they didn't want to.
People were killed in these 2 days, Jews.
They killed them, just for no reason.
Finally, the British did enter the city, when they could be seen not as invaders, but merely accompanying the king back to his throne. While the war raged in Europe and the Holocaust claimed 6 million Jewish lives, order was restored in Iraq. The Grand Mufti escaped via Iran and spent much of the war in Germany. The Dangors bought the house where he stayed.
Then it went back to almost to normal.
One forgets very quickly, and things slightly improve and continue.
And although
life.
the population turned against the Jews, it was not universal. They had personal relationships that
That's
they maintained.
True. Nothing has changed much. The war hardly touched them. The community was living in a bubble. They were not touched by the Holocaust, and they were living as if there was no war and nothing has happened much.
In 1948, the year after Renee had been crowned Miss Baghdad, she and Naim had their first baby, David.
Got no mansion, got no yacht, still I'm happy with what I've got. I got the sun in the morning and the moon at night. I got the sun in the morning and the moon.
But 1948 coloured all the rest of their lives, for other reasons.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל.
Palestine was partitioned to make way for the new Jewish nation, and many Palestinians lost their homes. Iraq and most of the neighbouring countries fought to defend them. At home, they started to see the Jews living amongst them, no longer as Iraqis, but as enemy aliens.
The main driver of the troubles for the Jews in the Arab world has been Israel. When the State of Israel was born in 1948, the Iraqis had sent a brigade to Palestine to fight against Israel. They had been badly beaten. Many had come back in coffins. And so the sentiment against the Jews rose in the street, a desire to take it out on the Jews. Life became intolerable.
The Iraqi government tried to look anti-Jewish. They put on a show trial, and Jews were sacked from government jobs.
And then 2 bombs went off. Only 1 person was killed, but that rather panicked the rest of the Jewish population. Jews realized that they were in danger.
My father felt very uncomfortable being in Iraq, and he made the decision to take his family out.
Isaac Baruch's father was an import-exporter living in Basra in southern Iraq.
My father left in 1950, which was very early on. He was one of the first people in the 50s to leave. They left almost everything when they left in 1950.
The Baruchs were in the vanguard. In 1951, Israel organised an airlift, 130,000 Iraqi Jews, indifferent Zionists until then, started their new life in the embattled country. Build a population. But there were tensions between the immigrants and Israel's European Jews, the Ashkenazis who had founded the country. The Million Project aimed to build a population. But soon there were tensions between the immigrants and Israel's European Jews, the Ashkenazis, who had founded the country.
There was 2 types of Jews. There was the Ashkenazis and there was the Sephardis. And there was a gap.
Looking like creatures from the Arabian Nights. It's a colorful sight, but scarcely a pretty one.
There was such a thing, a stigma about being an Arab Jew. You felt embarrassed.
A sort of weird costume ball unfolds in front of you. Amusing, bizarre, pathetic.
I think they looked down upon them. The Jews from Europe, they created the State of Israel. Europe had all the museums, they had all operas, all the composers, whereas there was none of this in the Middle East or Arab countries. So they always look down upon people from Arab countries, thinking that they're backwards, they don't have a culture, they don't have anything.
Some of these people may have been well-to-do or even wealthy, but you can't tell now, for they are all penniless.
When the Jewish neighborhood in Baghdad collapsed, when the shops, surgeries, businesses and schools closed down, it seemed to be the end of the culture that had produced the Talmud, the culture that was at the center of rabbinical thought for centuries. But though 130,000 left, there were 7,000 who stayed on. Most of the families in the team were from the set who stayed. Going was risky. Staying was risky. Even afterwards, no one could be certain they'd made the right choice. Where would they be secure? In Israel, despised by Israelis and in danger of war? Or in Iraq, where they were seen as surrogate colonials, if not an Israeli fifth column?
Those who stayed behind in 1951, by and large, were well-to-do. They were still in important places, in government, in parliament, education, in business. And money always bought them a certain amount of support. People said, we're going to be all right now. So these pictures would have been taken...
That's in front of the house?
Yes.
Jezra, by the riverbank.
We were all living together with my parents. Then my brothers got married and they lived with us.
My mum and dad were first cousins, and my Aunt Doreen and her husband Albert were first cousins. 6, 8, yes, well done, 14.
Yeah.
We have a gardener, plus a cook, a nanny, and a maid.
That's me.
Ah.
I never thought of them and us. It was just one family.
We had a lot of fun together. There were often parties in the evenings. All the gardens would be lit up and there'd be music and people coming in and chatting. And we, who were never allowed as youngsters to go to such parties, would be peering over the veranda and dreaming.
If you ever go down Trinidad, they make you feel so very glad. Calypso sing and make up rhyme, guarantee you one real good time.
The army was strong, the economy was strong, the country was getting rich quickly. They could see no shadow at all in the horizon.
Oil was flowing out and money was flowing in. Iraq had the first TV station in the Middle East and a consumer boom to furnish with product.
My father built up so many businesses in Iraq.
With his family or on his
No, he took a Muslim partner, Ahmed Safwat. They set up a match factory together, a furniture factory, and they also got the concession for Coca-Cola for the whole of Iraq. When I should have been doing homework, my dad would take me to see the office, which was in the commercial district of Baghdad. For a child, all the bright lights of the early evening, the new lit advertising hoardings for Colinos toothpaste and Coca-Cola. My father was looking forward to a bright future.
My father, he was sort of involved in building the infrastructure, the roads and the sewage for the new Baghdad, and eventually to parcel it out and sell it as homes.
Danny Dalal's parents moved into those suburbs when they left the abandoned Jewish district and started their family. They changed their name to Dalal to sound less Jewish.
Our house was only 4 or 5 years old when we moved into it. There were 3 Jewish houses in our street, but on our birthdays I remember we used to have all our neighbors over, and there was Christians, there was Shias, and lovely, lovely people. But everything, for all intents and purposes, is a Jewish surrounding. My dad was a director of a company, and they imported tires from Japan. My uncle, Isaac, I'm sitting on his lap. He used to have a factory, a chocolate factory. Now, can you imagine having an uncle with a chocolate factory? I remember going with him. He took us to the factory, and I have seen a bathtub full of chocolate, even bigger than a bathtub. Just the drops that came out of the bathtub were this big, that much solid chocolate. So that made him even more of a lovely uncle. I loved him an awful lot.
The future arrived at hectic speed for some, while others were living as they had for thousands of years. The 50s brought not just chocolate Coca-Cola in the suburban life, but a new and exuberant pleasure in semi-naked activities.
There were clubs there. My uncle used to go regularly. It was a lot of fun. We were members of the Mansour Club, and there was another club called the Alwiya Club. These are clubs established, I would imagine, by the British for the elite. The Mansour Club had 4 tennis courts, and if you can afford it, you're just a member of these clubs.
Until quite recently, the Arabs had little or no opportunity for recreation and sports. Now they delight in learning new games.
Did you play volleyball or tennis?
No. In the 40s, it wasn't so much done to go and play tennis and volleyball. There was YMCA in Baghdad, and probably they introduced all these sports. Yes.
In Israel, the leisured life was slower coming. Many of the Arab Jews who'd fled to Israel were still living in tents 5 years after leaving Iraq.
Difficult times in Israel, there was just a new state and life was difficult, work was difficult. They stayed there for about 5 years. But my father went wherever the business took him.
Soon, an Iraqi Jewish community sprang up in Iran, where Isaac Baruch's father went into the steel business.
Iran was still very backward. It caught up very soon with the rest of the Middle East, but in the 50s, it wasn't a very nice place.
To the new arrivals, Iran was in many ways similar to Iraq, but its position on the borders of the Soviet Union gave its strategic interest to the CIA. Iran's American placeman, the Shah, was bathed in cash. The economic development of Iran cast Iraq into the shade.
Although we lived in Iran, we were not part of the original Iranian Jewish community. We socialized with our own smaller community. My parents' friends were the same people who came from Iraq, same background, same traditions, same culture, the food.
We crave for this. It's called maraq jij, basic, old-fashioned Iraqi food.
Dalia grew up in Iran, amongst the 2,000 Iraqi Jews in Tehran who were there from 1951.
Added a little bit more spices to it.
Her father imported spare parts for cars.
It smells amazing. We were in an American school that had all sorts of religions. Oh, you're a Jew? Okay, big deal. the Iraqis of Iran. We're the most westernized Iraqis there were.
You didn't learn Hebrew?
We didn't learn Hebrew, no. They tried to teach us once, and it never happened. The Iraqi Jews, they were more conservative in their life.
How did you get your milk delivered?
The cow would be brought to the door, they would milk her into bottles.
Okay, yeah. No, Iran was slightly more modern, I'm afraid. We had a guy on a motorcycle with two big urns, or whatever you want to call them, on the side, and then we'd send by rope from the third floor on our flat, like a pot or something, and he would, with a ladle, he would put in 3 ladles or 4 ladles.
My grandmother always wanted to be sure that the cow was watched being milked, because there were always suspicions
that
people used to add water. So you did have to see who was coming direct from a cow.
By the early 50s, Iran, Iraq and Egypt were formally free of a colonial presence, but no less economically controlled than before. In Iraq, the British saw most of the profits from the oil fields, but it was Egypt that blew first.
Wild acclaim follows Egyptian President Nasser as he makes a public appearance following his seizure of the Suez Canal, seen by the fervently nationalistic Arab world as a triumphant blow at the Western powers, Britain, France, and the United States.
The crisis was more than the loss of the route east through the Suez Canal. Nasser had delivered a poke in the eye to the West, and Russia had proved that it could assert itself in the Middle East. It could happen again.
My father was afraid that the whole Middle East would get engulfed. I remember he used to listen to the news day and night. He couldn't get away from it 1 minute. When it sort of blew over, I still think he didn't cotton on to the idea that things have changed permanently. He never said, now's the time to get out. No, I didn't hear any of that. But the women, I mean, probably David Dangour's mother, and certainly my mother, were not happy. You could feel a kind of anxiety behind the sort of facade of easygoing life. I mean, to give you an example, we went to a Jewish school. At the end of the year, you had to take public exams, and the exams were taken in another school in the city. We were scared. If somebody, a Muslim, wanted to cheat, he was sitting next to us and says, give me the answer, we would give him the answer, because we were scared.
What do you do when you're uneasy? Keep up the facade with the children and carry on with the picnics.
In summer, the river water used to go down. And people used to go and build small tents, and they sleep there. They had music, they had masgoof fish on charcoal, and the next day they used to go to their work.
That was till when?
That was before the revolution. After the revolution, it wasn't so safe to do it.
Without warning, revolution has swept away the young King Faisal of Iraq and his uncle Crown Prince Abdul Ilah. Iraq becomes #1 danger spot.
Our house was on the riverfront and the royal palace was on the other side. We woke up on the morning of the 14th of July up to the sound of gunfire. Tut, 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 tut. It must have been sort of first light, and the radio came on announcing the army had taken over.
Veteran Premier Nouri Es-Said is deposed. He has fled, and the Republican rebels have offered £10,000 for his arrest. The Crown Prince is dead. Only one thing is certain: the Kremlin is jubilant.
This is Abdul Karim Qasim. He was the leader of the revolt. The idea that the king should be replaced by a republic was something strange to us and quite bewildering in some ways, even though we knew very little about politics. We knew something cataclysmic was happening.
Within days, the king and prime minister were summarily killed. The crown prince's mutilated body was displayed publicly, and Qasim had control of the country.
For a 9-year-old, that was quite powerful stuff.
Iraq was on a new path. Qasim belonged to the same military group as Nasser, and Iraq appeared to have changed sides in the Cold War.
The king used to be on the cover of our exercise books, and when we went back in September to school, all the exercise books had been reprinted. The original cover has been put on the inside now, and while it be difficult to see, you can make out the figure of King Faisal II of Iraq. The cover has been reversed, and on the front it has Madaris al-Jamhuriyya al-Iraqiyya, the schools of the Republic of Iraq. When the king had been brutally killed, my mother said, I don't want to live in a country that can do this, and drag their bodies through the street. My father had hoped to make his life in the land of his forefathers. He was upset.
In July 1959, Naim and Renee finally made the decision. They took David and his brothers and left the country.
There were travel restrictions after the revolution. We went to Lebanon for a year, and after that year we came to England when we had finally got our entry permit from the British authorities. I never went back.
The Dangours arrived in London, a fraction as rich as they had been. The family rented in London's Albert Hall mansions, and Naim bought a flat to develop above a shop in Kensington. They put the kids into a Jewish school and started to feel at home. Along with a diminished community of 4,000 Jews, David's Aunt Eileen stayed on in Abu Nawas Street, looking after her husband, her parents, Freddie and his brother.
My father had his work in Baghdad, and he never thought of leaving. We loved our country, and we stayed there. After the revolution, we had to bring it down. We didn't want anybody to come and see we have the king hanged on the wall. We put it down, we wrapped it, and put it away in a storeroom.
I mean, they decided to stay because things more or less were good. You know, they didn't do anything wrong. Things were okay. There were certain periods when things were bad, but in general things were okay, and so they didn't feel that they made a mistake.
In fact, Qasim was good to the 4,000 Jews who had stayed in Baghdad, and people loved him for seizing most of Britain's oil assets. However, the CIA had him in their sights. He lasted 5 years.
The streets of ancient Baghdad become the scene of a short but decisive revolution that topples the pro-communist government of Premier Abdel Karim Qasim.
In May 1963, the CIA was behind a successful coup by the Ba'ath Party.
First pictures from Iraq show the intensity of the fighting, which was directed not only at the Qasim government, but also against the thousands of East European communists who had infiltrated the country. A 6-man military junta seizes power on a holy day, and within hours the premier, who reportedly had executed 10,000 people, is himself shot.
Within months, the new Ba'ath regime confiscated all passports belonging to Jews. Now they were stuck. The decision to stay began to look like a mistake.
People were afraid.
There was a lot of army personnel everywhere in the streets, tanks in the streets. You know, there was just that atmosphere of fear, not wanting to be known or seen, just in case, you know, it's taken as if someone is doing something wrong.
At weekends, we went to the sports ground. This was called al-Mal'ab,
the Jewish sports ground. On the other side of it,
there was a football pitch. If we kicked the ball out, all the kids from all the neighborhoods,
the Arab kids,
they would come, and
suddenly we get a whole hail of stones, and we have to just run. And if somebody's going to throw a stone, we're going to throw a stone back, which is what we did.
My weekly treat, which I used to look forward to with great excitement, was the comic called Samir. My grandfather Elia used to send them once a week. I can still remember today the smell of the print, which used to start the excitement as I started to leaf through my new issue. My favorite story was a group of scouts from Cairo. Leader of them was someone called Basil. He used to suss out the villains and arrange for them to be captured and keep the world a safer place.
The tension in the Middle East develops into full-scale war, with reports of heavy fighting between Israeli and Egyptian forces along the Gaza Strip and the Sinai border.
In the summer of 1967, Syrian, Jordanian and Egyptian troops massed on Israel's borders, and Iraq's Prime Minister vowed to wipe Israel off the map. Israel launched a surprise attack in 4 different directions.
Everything changed in 1967 when the Six-Day War started. I particularly remember my mum picked us up from school, panic in her face. The traffic was stopped. An army convoy with lots of soldiers holding their guns high. They were celebrating because they're finally, I suppose the way they saw it, going to liberate Palestine from Israel. They never called it in Israel, they called it the entity. And I remember my brother distinctly saying, you know, this is very bad for us. If the Israelis win, then they're going to come back and take their revenge on us. And if the Israelis lose, well, we're all goners anyway.
The Israelis won, with humiliating decisiveness. Here are the English Dangors on holiday in Israel, celebrating the victory, clambering on the charred remains of the Iraqi tanks. Naim trained with the officers who led the Iraqi troops to war. He still owned his Iraqi army uniform. But for his sister and for the families in Baghdad, the Iraqi defeat was catastrophic.
Literally within 2 or 3 days of the war, some people were being arrested. Not officially arrested, but they were just taken out of their homes.
Jewish people couldn't go to university after the Six-Day War. Once they finished school, they couldn't go to university. They were not allowed. They couldn't work in any government departments or any public places, and all Jews were kicked out of all the clubs. They couldn't become members of clubs anymore.
My mother was placed immediately under house arrest. Luckily, she knew the chief inspector of police in Baghdad. He protected her. 2 or 3 times they were going to arrest my grandfather, and the inspector of police intercepted the order and tore it up. There was a lot of help from our Muslim friends.
We had many more visitors than we would normally have because Mom can't chat on the phone anymore.
Telephone lines were cut.
Telephone lines were cut. You know, we had very nice Muslim neighbors. They came and they said, we give you the key of the house. Whenever you want to use our telephone, come and use our telephone. We said, no thank you, we don't take a key. But nobody has a telephone. To whom shall we phone? There's no one that we can phone.
You had this feeling that all eyes were upon you all the time. We can't afford to look like Jewish kids out in the street. So in the street we start speaking Muslim. We used to change names. For example, if you're calling your friend and he's other side of the street, you don't call Meyer. If his name is Meyer, you don't call Meyer because suddenly you're attracting attention. That's a Jewish name. We're Jews. You don't do that. So you change his name to Maher.
Children, they were too young to get involved, but of course they knew there was something wrong.
Some idiot bastard thug stopped a bus in the middle of the street and ordered all the Jews to come out to come out of the bus, and started beating them up. And one of them was my brother. I never knew these things could happen.
In government circles, all these measures were thought to be insufficient, not attracting much attention outside the Jewish community. The Ba'ath leadership wanted a show of strength, something impressive, to mark a reaction to the Six-Day War. Saddam Hussein, the new deputy leader in charge of security, was given the job of making it spectacular.
They rounded up a number of people, mostly Jews, and they accused them of being spies for Israel and for the West.
But when they said spies, I remember my dad's complexion changed. He said, "Uh-oh, that doesn't sound good." He knew that they probably meant the Jews.
A show trial of the suspects was mounted in January 1969.
On the day of the trial, I remember we were petrified, all of us, because they said on the newspaper the day before that there was going to be some Jewish people in there, and suddenly we see them on television. The prosecution was demanding already the death sentence. We were all just watching television, and the doorbell rings, and when the doorbell rings in the middle of the night, even though for me, even 9 o'clock in the evening, and for everybody, there's no reason for that doorbell to ring unless it's trouble. And sure enough, it was my aunt saying, "Help, they've taken Isaac, my uncle." They had come to ask him to chat. And yet, all those other Jewish people were being killed and hanged. And there was gigantic celebrations all over Tahrir Square.
Even the president went. He was underage. He was 16, I think. They told him if he says that he is 18, they will release him. So he believed them. He said he's 18 years old, but they hanged him all the same.
Every single day brought stories and brought hopes, false hopes. No matter what we tried, no matter how we tried, we could not find out where he was. For me, it was like almost the end of the world.
It could have been us. My father organized a demonstration. About 5,000 people came in Queen's Gate outside the Iraqi embassy. We wanted to draw the attention of the world to the plight of our friends and family. I had been inside that embassy only a week before to borrow Arabic books to keep my Arabic up. And I developed a little bit of a personal rapport with people. Of course, I never went back ever again into that embassy.
Several demonstrations made no impact. There was a continuous stream of disappearances and hangings, a few at a time, or in small groups. Another 90 Jews vanished from their families. 6 months after the celebrations in Tahrir Square, there was news of Danny's uncle.
It was a notice, like one of those adverts you sell an apartment. On the 5th page, in a side column, Ishaq Dalal and his partner were found guilty yesterday of spying, and they will be hanged tomorrow morning. I remember staying up all night, just hoping for an earthquake, something logical, like an earthquake, another coup d'etat. I did something. But of course, it did happen. He was hanged, and even after that, nobody got to see his body. That was my turning point, I guess. But there was only one thought, which is the same thing as everybody had, just one thought left. Let's get out.
Jews were not allowed to have passports, so they couldn't leave the country. So there was no other option, just to flee.
71, that year at school, was the year you go into school every morning, you count and you look around who's left in your classroom. You have no idea who's actually shemos, skedoodled. That's yeah. I can point to a photo here of the people who played volleyball in our year. Top row ran away in 1970 with his family. The third one is me. Fourth one ran away. Where's Abraham? He's not there. He went. He ran away. Fuad was the sixth. His father was murdered. And God forbid if anybody was absent with a cold or anything, because immediately rumors spread in the whole school. So-and-so did not come in today. They must have run away. The family must have run away. So we obviously started trying to find out how did they do it. Plans were to go on holiday as such to northern Iraq. It's beautiful, it's lovely. Many people went there regularly for summer holidays. So this was an opportunity to get into the Kurdish areas. Once we're in the Kurdish areas, we're pretty much safe because they didn't have any animosity towards us. We would be relatively safe from there to cross the border to Iran, which at the time had a relationship with Israel. So we knew that this was finally a proper way to escape.
Love was only true in fairy tales.
And if you could get there, Iran was the coolest place in the Middle East.
Not for me.
We had a great time over there. We did horseback riding, we had tennis. It was a beautiful life out there.
A lot of socializing, a lot of poker, a lot of fun.
In Tehran, there's mountains. So you can go skiing, you can just drive for 20 minutes and go skiing. It was so easy, it was really easy.
We had a very good life while we were in Iran. We lived well, we were not discriminated by the larger Muslim community, we lived among them. We considered ourselves part of that society.
We didn't have any problem there.
We traveled. We took planes, we went to Israel, we came back from Israel. There was all sorts of Israeli societies, there was an Israeli embassy. That's it, we lived there.
We lived in a bubble and we were very privileged, so we didn't feel any difficulty at all.
Like their ancestors who'd fled Iraq for Persia in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, in the early 70s a new wave of Iraqi Jews crossed the mountains and took refuge in Tehran. They were smuggled by Kurdish traffickers.
The person in charge, he comes back with a message. The message is half the dinar that they took with them. They leave one half with the people in Baghdad, so we know that they arrived safely.
Every Iraqi housed a few of their relatives, like, there were cousins or second cousin or third cousins. They came for a few days and then they made their way to wherever they were going.
But most families went through a period of paralyzing fear and did nothing.
In the morning, my father used to take us to school, then pick us up lunchtime, come back home, and that's it, and not venture out again. Nobody knew once you're out, you might be, arrested for some reason or another. So we never ventured out.
So they were at home all day long. It's mad, an 18-year-old, 19-year-old at home every day. There's no prospect of jobs. because they kicked everybody out of jobs. So the pressure of kids and their relationship with their parents was huge. Mom, when are we going? Day in, day out, day in, day out. A huge pressure on parents. It tore families apart.
At one time, they were trying to put us all in a camp, to send us in a camp, all the Jews. So I was so frightened about the children, I decided to give them to some friends, Christian friends. So if we were killed, never mind, but I wanted to save the boys.
It was very scary. And actually a classmate of mine, a girl, one day didn't show up, and that was in 1972 probably. And then we found out that actually her whole family, including her, were massacred inside their house.
My mother, when she was in Baghdad, we had an idea that she was planning to run away. She wanted to take the risk, but she was not at all an adventurous person. She was anxious, very insecure, very insecure. She tried to keep herself occupied. She was making dolls.
Did you think of trying to escape?
No.
Why not?
We were afraid to do that.
At the time, I saw my parents as being guilty of having stayed. I kept saying, why didn't you leave? Why are we all here? I was just accusing my parents of putting us into this situation. And for me, what was the reason? Is it just to have this life, which apparently looked good, nice home, nice cars? You cling to this.
In 1971, the Dalal family tried to escape, but they were caught in the mountains, interned for 3 weeks, and sent back to Baghdad.
Books.
6 months later, they decided to risk it again.
I wonder if it's still valid. I wonder if I can still drive in Baghdad. Normal driving license, full driving license. Our ID used to have a stamp on it saying Jewish. This doesn't. It wasn't required. So we used to produce it wherever we go, in the streets or if we're needed. But we particularly got it so that when we're traveling when we're traveling to the north, they stop everybody for ID. And this would come in very handy. You could be Christian, could be anybody. You would leave it exactly like you're coming back in about an hour or two. The home has to be your proof, your alibi, that no, you were not trying to escape the country. Okay. Look, if I was trying to escape the country, I would have sold all my furniture. The first time round, the fridge wasn't that full, but the second time round, the fridge was totally full. So that just in case. And we took some extra cutlery. Two pieces more of cutlery. Just in case we get arrested again and we need them in prison again.
They close the door and they go. They don't tell anybody, just in case.
You do not tell your closest friend.
Just in case they spread the word. And then they will be caught.
There's no doubt. It was definitely a question of life or death.
The message was relayed under darkness. They were dressed as Kurdish women, were bundled in a taxi and sped their way to the north.
Come darkness, we got on a jeep, and there was a friend of mine, classmate of mine, who appeared out of nowhere sitting in front of me, him and his brother and his sister. We think we have it all planned and we know what's happening, but here we are in a car with a total stranger. We've never met this guy. He is, after all, a smuggler. This is a dangerous situation.
They were driving all night east through the mountains, and you could see lights on the hills, indicating the route.
There was loads of people in the car, 7 or 8 people. So when we crossed the border between Arab Iraq and Kurdish Iraq, and the guy turned round and said, "You're okay now, you've made it." It was amazing. We knew that we were free, and we were just ecstatic. When we arrived in Tehran, we had all the nice living and all that. We had all the clubs. It all looked so familiar, you know. And this is what we were doing in Baghdad only a couple of years ago. Fun.
Iran was only a staging post for the Dalals. Danny's family, along with hundreds of others, chose London. By the end of 1972, the Jewish community in Baghdad had dwindled to a couple of hundred. Even the school closed down. The Ba'ath Party's attention had drifted elsewhere, and Eileen was able to get a passport for Freddie and his brother.
1973, I sent Freddie and Robbie to London because we were so afraid. I just wanted them to be safe. They stayed with my sister, and my parents were supposed to leave after. Well, they planned. Of course, they didn't know there was going to be a war.
Saturday the 6th of October, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar.
Eileen's parents were already on board their plane when yet another war with Israel broke out. After some rapid rerouting, her parents flew away. Eileen, however, had missed her chance.
Because of the war, they stopped our passports. We couldn't leave. So that year was really bad for us.
Eileen and Dawood shrank back into the house. No work, no children, and no community. And then a year later, as arbitrarily as their passports had been taken away, they were given back again.
So we closed the door. We had our suitcases with us. We went to a friend's house, and the next morning we went to the airport and left.
Eileen was finally reunited with her family in London on the 18th of December 1974.
Once you leave the country and don't return within 3 months, then all your property is confiscated.
And you lose your nationality.
And you lose your nationality. You're not considered Iraqi anymore.
3 months. This is a miniature of the tigress.
The Iranian Iraqis thought they were the lucky ones who had chosen the right country to go to. And until 1978, that's how it seemed.
In 1979, February, that's when the revolution happened. It was a revolution against the Shah and the monarchy. It wasn't a revolution that discriminated against Jews, but inevitably, when the other side are religious people, Israel became an issue. The sides all of a sudden they shifted.
Privilege, that was a problem as well. I guess being Jewish was more serious than being privileged. It wasn't getting nice. Business was getting hard.
All Israeli companies that were working in Iran had to finish. By then, we made the decision that we've got to leave.
After 26 years in Iran, the Baruch family made their second migration in June 1980.
We managed to salvage some of the business, but we did leave behind a lot of things which are still there in my father's name.
Everybody left. It's a shame. If there was no revolution, we would have stayed, definitely.
But there's one thing they took with them.
We come from the Middle East, we know how to play volleyball.
By 1980, 5,000 Iraqi Jews had settled in London. They married.
Here's the sukkah. We built it on Sunday.
It's huge.
They had children.
We have our door.
Oh, wow.
Here we come.
This is really something.
It's more elaborate than the one we had in Baghdad.
Right.
They listened to their Iraqi CDs.
Smells nice.
They ate the old food.
It's Persian za'afran.
I know exactly how to win.
And played cards like their parents did.
Yes.
It's kasher because you're up to the sky.
Lights here as well.
And in September they built huts, like in the desert 3,000 years ago.
Old tradition with modern technology.
Fantastic.
And we are supporting England.
Very straight.
Yes, finally.
See?
And in time, their children have joined the volleyball team. Naeem was determined not to fade gently away. He started a club in the old style. He posted a newsletter across the world. He campaigned. People started to call him the Exarch of Babylon, King of the Jews in exile.
My father felt now it was time that the story be told. It seemed sad that there should be no record after 2,500 years since the Babylonian exile. There would be some history, there would be cookery, there would be current affairs. There's a column, Baghdad Proverbs. One whose stomach is full does not feel the pangs of the hungry.
But Babylon wasn't going to be forgotten that easily. In 2003, Iraq was once again a superpower battleground. And a wisp of the past rose from the conflict.
My father was interviewed on the eve of the war. They asked him for some photos, and this was one of the ones he gave. My mother winning Miss Baghdad 1947. An Iraqi newspaper in Britain picked up this picture. They coloured it in a little, giving her a yellow sash and an orange-pink dress, and they published it with a sort of wistful commentary underneath, saying, كانت بغداد مدينة للسلام والتسامح تشرب قهوتها بهدوء. Baghdad used to be a city of peace and tolerance, where people enjoyed calmly drinking their coffee, strolling with ease, retiring at night with confidence, and waking up in the morning with a new hope. People were really living the good life. Now my mother appears in about 2,500 websites. How she has become a symbol of what they see as the best days of Iraq.
So in spite of the war, in spite of the destruction, and in spite of Israel, over 60 years after she was crowned, Renee is still a dream for those who believe in an Iraq for all Iraqis. But the volleyball players, are they still Iraqi?
We're the generation that's very mixed up. As when people ask us, where are you from? It's a very difficult question. You can't answer with one word.
My answer is always, I was born in Baghdad. And they say, okay.
I guess I'd say Jewish first, Iraqi second, and British third. That's what I'd say. No, maybe that's wrong.
I suppose people who lived in the Middle East or in Arab countries are Arabs.
Yes, but I'm Jewish.
Well, when I was 12, people tell me where you're from, I say Iran. Today, it's very mixed up.
I never considered myself an Arab.
You can't be both. I'm sorry, I'm afraid I'm both.
Jewish first, Iraqi second, Iranian third, and then fourth British.
My children, they actually like being called Iraqis.
This is not a straightforward answer, is it? No.
Since 1948, 150,000 Jews have left Iraq. They were precursors of the millions of other Iraqis who have also fled their country. They are fleeing, even today.
We have Iraqi friends, and I'm talking about Muslim friends. But I don't think they would dare at this point to go back. I think it's even more difficult for them than for us. And I think they suffered as much, if not more.
We still think the new community will be re-established. Iraq is still in our blood, in our bones.
There are now 6 Iraqi Jews living in Baghdad.
And I don't want to go back. I felt that we were hurt. We were hurt very much. I know that there's a lot of people who left Baghdad in the good times. So they have a nice nostalgic memory of it. My memory, personally, is just marred by loss of my uncle. Perhaps it's the personal loss, specifically personal loss in life, that is the divider.
So I wouldn't like to go now because it's all in ruins. The places I know are not the same. So it's better to remember everything as it is.
Or as it was.
As it was, sorry. I was dreaming.